My name's Mark McGann. I'm coming to Belfast to perform a show called The Two of Us, the John Lennon and Paul McCartney songbook.
I should have known better with a girl like you.
The show itself is a really kind of unique journey, spectacular, which has featured the most amazing arrangements by Andrew Cotti. They are really quite extraordinary. And three vocalists, myself, Joe Stilgoe, who's Richard Stilgoe's son, and a fantastic jazz singer called Claire Martin. The show itself tells the story of the songwriting relationship between John Lennon and Paul McCartney in a way that I think is really rather unique. It's very, very clever in how it reveals the story behind a lot of the songs that are so well known and obviously perennial favourites, and it's great fun to do. I think the thing essentially that makes this different, to really understand and appreciate it, it's probably worthwhile having a little bit of the background for how the show came about. I think what you stand to face, to encounter a lot with the Beatles music these days, because we're now getting to beyond the boys actually being alive themselves. I don't want to wish anybody's life away, but you know, it won't be very long before the Beatles will be of a former generation. What happens over a period of time, I think, very, very naturally with music from certain eras, is it goes through a phase of being slightly parodied, until such time as it becomes so much a solid part of past history that it's revisited and kind of reformulated for a contemporary audience, I suppose. What you've seen with the Beatles music, I think, in the last 40 years in particular, is a propensity towards an elevation of the status of their music, quite understandably, but in a way that always says tribute. First and foremost, it says tribute. And I think that always runs the risk of being slightly parodied. What I was interested in exploring when I was approached to write this play, this show, was really something that delved a little bit more into the reality of the relationship between the two boys. Specifically, not only the story behind, you know, the incipient phases of these wonderful compositions and how they came about, what the boys were actually doing at the time, but more to do with the kind of very symbiotic relationship that the two boys had. They were very, very different personalities in many ways. They just happened to be friends who met with a love of composition, of original composition, at a time when I suppose most of their peers were playing the same sort of music which was coming in from the ships and rock and roll from the United States and so on and so forth. Of course, they could do that as well, as we saw in Hamburg. But what you get with, if you look a little more closely and you use the compositions themselves as a prism through which to see their journey, is because you've got the benefit of the autobiographical nature of the way that Lennon wrote songs, for instance, you've also got that contrasted with McCartney's very developed awareness of pastiche, I think, through his familial relationship when he was quite young. And the combination of those two things leads to a massive expansiveness in terms of the landscape they were able to explore. You mix that with the fact that they were probably the first ones who were doing that sort of stuff, that, you know, they were fortunate in that way to be in place at the right time. And you have this wonderful combination which, when seen chronologically, provides a beautiful arc for a show, a story, of all kinds of different stories, actually. So for me, the fact that we have kind of settled for more of a tribute relationship with the subject matter, it seems to me to be really kind of missing a number of key opportunities, which I think this show tries to address. And on that basis, I think there is something rather original about it. The reason I ended up writing this show, I suppose, I can't escape from the fact that I played John Lennon as an actor. One of my earliest breaks was playing John Lennon on stage, and then I got to play him on screen for the Americans in 1985. So as early as 1982, I was becoming acquainted with the subject matter. The fact that I'm also from Liverpool, I suppose, it's not quite as straightforward, that relationship, as people have often presumed, but it certainly helped in terms of having a confidence about a sense of where they were from and so on and so forth. And certainly, frequenting familiar haunts and stuff like that when I was younger How this particular show came about was quite interesting, because in 2008, when Liverpool was awarded the Capital of Culture, and I hadn't actually worked in Liverpool for about 15 or 20 years at that time, I was approached by the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic to come and perform in a show called the John Lennon Songbook. And I hadn't done anything to do with Lennon. I hadn't touched anything to do with the subject for about 15 years. And so it felt like the time was right. I wanted to be involved in the spectacular that was the Capital of Culture celebrations for the city, which was amazing. And I was very flattered to be approached. John Wilson, who's a wonderful conductor, he was conducting the show, and Claire Martin was involved, and Curtis Stigers was involved in that show too. And it was a fantastic experience. It worked brilliantly, using a very similar arc to the journey of the show, the narrative journey of the show, that I'd kind of been used to when performing the play Lennon. And that is, it's ready-made for you with John Lennon's story, because he wrote so autobiographically. Literally, if you play his songs in chronological order, you get a beautifully, naturally unfolding sequence of events which tells a complete story that has a tragic ending. So, unlike Two of Us, the John Lennon Songbook was one of those shows that was monumental in that it kind of represented a communal outpouring of grief as well as a celebration by the end of it. It's very, very poignant, because you can't help but finish with his death and then Yoko's speech in Strawberry Fields afterwards. And then you finish with Imagine, and it's kind of ready-made for that sort of treatment. Having had the success of the John Lennon Songbook and taken it around the world as well with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic, I was approached by John Wilson, who was working at the time with McCartney, because Paul was doing his Liverpool oratorio with Carl Davis, I think, at the time. And apparently Paul McCartney had said to John Wilson, I see you've been doing the John Lennon Songbook. Would you consider doing a show with my music in it too? And of course, we bit his hand off with it. And John approached me, as if we wouldn't, you know. And John approached me to do that, and I said, yeah, I think it would be a great idea. I wanted to get Bob Eaton involved, because Bob had been involved in Lennon with me, and I hadn't had an excuse to work with him for 20-odd years. And so it was nice coming together of old mates as well. What happened was we ended up performing it in 2010 for the first time with the Royal Liverpool Phil. And it was a wonderful contrast to the sort of experience of the John Lennon Songbook. It was an opportunity to do stuff, a happy show. First and foremost, it's a really, really happy show. That doesn't mean it's happy at the expense of, you know, a certain gratification that people might want about the story itself. And there's conflict in the story too, of course, we know, because we cover the end of the Beatles as well, and we know that there were loggerheads between the two chaps. So all of that's covered in the show itself, but the overall effect of it is very, very uplifting and very, very happy. So doing the two shows in tandem was a lot of fun. We went to China and did it in tandem there. We even did a performance for the Chinese government in the Forbidden City in Beijing. And what was really poignant about that, which I never knew, was that when we were there, we did the John Lennon Songbook one night, and we did the Two of Us the following night. And after the John Lennon Songbook, they disclosed to me something I never knew, and that was that Lennon was due to go to China for the first time, to go to Beijing the month after he died. So they were kind of left up in the air a lot. So for them, there was something very significant about inviting us over and listening to the music, and, you know, kind of seeing him as closely as they possibly could without him being there, I guess. That's really how it came about. It came about as a result of the success of the John Lennon Songbook, and it's been performed ever since. We've taken it out on the road. The last time we performed it was with the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra only a month or so ago. And again, it's always full. There's always standing ovations. People love singing along with the encore at the end, which is Hey Jude, you know. But these are just the kind of added bonuses, really, on what I think is a really fantastically stimulating and interesting look at a story that you might think you know, but there's stuff that you won't know. And of course, the show itself, Two of Us, wouldn't be really possible And it certainly wouldn't be achievable to the standard it's managed to maintain over the last couple of years if it wasn't for the other artists in it. It's, you know, who make me look better than I am, probably. No, it sounds like faux modesty, but they really do, because they're really brilliant at what they do. We've got Claire Martin, who's an extraordinary singer, jazz singer, who's now, I should probably address her as Claire Martin OBE, because that's what she is now. And Joe Stilgo, of course, who's an extremely talented pianist and vocalist himself. These are both award-winning recording artists. It's a great pleasure for me because I can't tell you how grateful they both are to be involved in this show. And that was a little bit of a surprise to me. You're never quite sure how artists in their own right are going to take to doing something which could be perceived as them, you know, stepping outside the kind of acceptable boundaries of what it is to build a career as an individual artist, as a self-determining artist. But no, apparently it seems that this is all completely acceptable as far as they're concerned, and they are brilliant in the show, absolutely brilliant. Some breathtaking vocals, and what's moving for me is as an actor, because they would never have classified themselves as actors before working with them, and I've tried to encourage them both to act more in it, especially Joe, obviously, is how willingly they've taken to that and how much stimulation they seem to get from it. I've insisted in recent years, because I've taken kind of personal control of the selling of the show, if you like, to different orchestras. And I've insisted on doing it only if we can retain that same team, including David Brophy as well as conductor, who's we've been through a number of conductors with the show, but David Brophy I think is my favourite. I think he's also the other vocalist's favourite as well, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that. He just, not only does he get us and he gets the show and he gets the kind of vibe, but there's no aspect of him thinking that he's undermining his own very high standards and remit by venturing into something which is as popular, you know, and as contemporary as this, which can be the case sometimes, I think, in the classical world, and I understand that. But Dave he's a wonderful personality, so he fills the stage when we're not doing our thing. Of course, the energy of the show is really being, you know, emanating from him. It's really being established by him, and I think he's perfect for it as well. So we have an ensemble, really, a team that we insist on keeping together because it's such a happy team. And, you know, we help that. What it's also done is that we've also, you know, agreed right at the beginning, it's such a happy show. We want nothing to ever challenge that in any way that's going to be negative. And so we've all agreed in very, very simple terms to have no negotiations. We're all on the same. You know, for the purposes of public knowledge, we're all on the same for it, because the ensemble is everything. So that tells you everything about the spirit of the show, and it makes a huge difference. I want to say a couple of things about the orchestrations, really, because they're done by an arranger called Andrew Cotti, and Andrew is an amazing artist who lives, last I heard, he was living in this kind of place in the countryside, and he comes into contact with very few people, and all he does is he gets his head down and he works. He has produced, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, it has to be said, some of the most extraordinary takes on these seriously well-known pieces of music. Now, when you're doing any celebration, any show around Lennon and McCartney's music, there's always going to be a certain aspect of tunes being so powerfully famous, so powerfully in the public domain, that they limit the ability for you to really revisit them and re-express them. And I think to a large degree, that's inevitable. So you have certain songs in the show, like A Day in the Life. And A Day in the Life on Sgt. Pepper, of course, was most famous for its massive orchestrated ending, where it builds up into an orchestrated crescendo. We have to do that, because if we didn't do that with the orchestra there, people would feel really disappointed. But that's one of only maybe two occasions in the evening, the other being probably Penny Lane, which has such an iconic brass section that you're expecting that too, where these songs don't offer some surprise to the audience, to the listener. And I think that is genius. I really do. I think it's brilliant what he's done. Some of the arrangements serve as underscore, so it gives him more leeway perhaps to be able to explore a completely different take on them, or what feels like a fresh take on these songs. He does that brilliantly. And then with others, where he's doffing his cap to what people are expecting because they're so well loved, he then adds another dimension. Take something like Eleanor Rigby. We know Eleanor Rigby is very, very famous for the string section. I talk in the show as John about how that came about because Paul was being turned on to Vivaldi by his girlfriend Jane Asher at the time. So we're expecting the string section, but how he then elaborates on the original idea of Lennon and McCartney, I think, is what makes these things special. You can only do that if it's not just about being bold, in my opinion, it's about having a vision too. And a vision that has to at least match the integrity and the skill set of the original composers. And I think he manages to do that in a way that I've never come across. And having been in some ways touched by this subject most of my professional life, maybe I've got some, insight to be able to say that. I've been asked about playing John Lennon, of course, many times in my life for obvious reasons, and people are interested, and I'm pleased that they're interested in wanting to know these things. It would be very easy and rather glib of me to be able to have a set of stock responses to that. What I try to avoid really is relaying too many personal feelings about what I'm trying to do in terms of the maintenance of his name or his reputation or how he might be perceived in the public domain. The role of an actor is a very, very particular one, and it's a great privilege, first and foremost. I think for anybody in their professional life, whether they be scientists, whether they be artists, if they get the luxury of exploring one particular area under the microscope with increasing magnification, which is a natural consequence of what happens when you do it over a period of time and through certain ages, as I have with this character. And so what that does is a strange thing. It removes almost instantly the relationship that you may have had initially as somebody who you've naturally put on a pedestal, because you've looked up to him, maybe because he was a fellow Liverpudlian, maybe because he was just because you digged his music. Because I did love Lennon, and he was my favourite Beatle. It was as simple as that. I don't feel that way about him anymore. The more I've managed to, I've had the privilege of being able to explore in different guises, in different ways, in different shows, and of course to different degrees, the story of his life and his personality. The more I've become moved, really, by the humanity. And I think that's a natural part of the process of studying anybody to make them come to life as an actor, which is different, and I qualify it in this way. It's different from doing voices and doing a parody. There may be certain aspects of it being slightly more parodic for a concert, because we don't get so much time to go into detail. But I try where I can to offset that with a certain realism, with a certain naturalism. So it's more for me about realizing what happens to actors is, as opposed to somebody who does voices like an Alistair McGann when he's doing his voices, or a Rory Bremner, is you find ways of closing the distance between yourself and the character you're playing. So it doesn't matter who it is. It might be somebody very, very famous like John Lennon. It might be somebody who's completely fictitious. But ultimately, you have to start from a kind of natural juxtaposition, and that distance between the two people has to be closed. So over the years for me, I feel it's been more symbiotic in a way. I feel I've absorbed so much more about him, which stops me from maybe jumping to the conclusions or having the nice little sound bites to say about what I think about him as a person, who I think he is, because clearly he was very complex. I think everybody knows that. But I think what moves me, I suppose, most about that journey is how difficult he found being the insecure person he was. I don't think it was natural for him to be a public person, and that's always the heavy irony for anybody who has the sort of damage that he was carrying around from his early age. In addition to that, I have the massive reward of playing these compositions, and the music is spellbinding. It is, I mean, to play it, to inhabit it, to own it sufficiently so you feel as though you can represent the person who's actually written this stuff, if you like, means taking on board, making leaps of judgment about, hopefully informed over the years, about what kind of urges are producing this thing and allowing that to kind of colour the relationship you have with these things. And that's when it gets really interesting. So there are times when I've been kind of in John Lennon mode, if you like, and thought, oh, I didn't realise it was hurting that much. There were other times when I've been in John Lennon mode and thought, I'd never had the urge to be that cruel in my life. You know, so there are all aspects of the character, very, very complex character. But what's lovely about Two of Us, to come back to Two of Us, is when you see the addition of Paul McCartney in his life, in his periphery, which is really what we focus on for the purposes of this show. Something very different happens to Lennon. There's still that competitive thing. There was always the competitive thing. They're more siblings in that respect than anything else. That's the best way to think about them, probably the most helpful way to think about them. But there's also, you know, I can understand people occasionally over the years romanticizing their relationship to the degree whereby they wondered whether or not there was something more going on between the two of them, because there's definitely a solace that they both found in each other's company, which was unique. And I think it calmed John down considerably being with Paul, whatever that was. And I'm not even sure that Paul was completely aware or would even be able to vocalize what that was indeed. And I think there was something that Paul got in reverse as well with John. I think Paul needed somebody like a John as well. I think Paul was clever enough to realize that coming from the background that he came from, he was the kind of kid who'd play anything. John wasn't. John struggled. I even say at one point in the show, you know, as Lennon, he says something like, Paul had a special gift when it came to making up tunes. You know, with me, I'd start with the poetry, the theme that got me started with the poetry side of the thing, and then I'd have to put the music to it, but that was the part of the job I enjoyed the least, you know. Everything I wrote seemed to cost me, whereas he only had to bend over and the real tune appeared, you know. It was that kind of thing. And of course, that's exactly what it was like for the two of them. So they got great solace from each other. And I think that was actually highlighted, interestingly, for me anyway, I don't know whether you agree, in the Peter Jackson film recently, Get Back, which I think was a really important film in terms of how it's changed the perception of their story, because I think that was quite overdue. The stories that I was involved in the 80s and the 90s about Lennon's life were very much telling the tale which was geared towards the recognition of the tragic end of his life. But really, seeing it now retrospectively, that's only one perspective. And what the Get Back film shows us very, very, very clearly is they were having a great time with each other right up until the end of the Beatles. So I'm aware of that. I still think there are remnants of the other perspective that have been retained for Two of Us, because we go through a wonderful section where we're in Abbey Road, and the orchestra all become actors. So they're all tuning up while Paul and John are having the fight, as in Abbey Road, as it happened. And it's amazing to see them getting involved in the action, in the scene that way. They love it. They absolutely love it, you know. So for them, it offers them also as an experience something a little less ordinary, something out of the norm. And that's such a great thrill to be involved in. If you're not snobby about certain things, and you start realizing that it's all about the quality of how much you look and how you're looking. It's academics talk in exactly the same way. You know, you can continue to find more out about something just by changing the way you look at it and looking at it better each time. And I think that's kind of how I see it now, you know. And of course, the great thrill for myself, and I know Joe Stilgo and Claire Martin are really looking forward to it too, but I think it's going to be particularly special for me to come to Belfast. I haven't worked in Belfast, or I haven't worked in Northern Ireland actually, since we did the Hanging Gale in 1994, which is a really special time, of course. And it was a difficult time because it was during the peace process. We had a window of opportunity to do the story, and we told a very particular story. I think in a way, whether or not we would tell the same story now, I don't know, but I do. It's a time I remember very, very, very fondly. We worked in Derry, and we also went across the border and we worked in Donegal and stuff. But I've always had a really great relationship with Belfast. I love the people there. It's not massively dissimilar in terms of its cultural, well, certainly its social history. For all its uniqueness as far as, the last couple of hundred years, which is well documented, is concerned, the aspects of Belfast that I really connect with are its arts. It's got a fantastic music scene. It always has had. It's always a great place to go out in, and I've always loved it for that reason. And some of my, better friends have come from there too. But they remind me so much of, it's like the Liverpool family. It's like there is a connectivity there between the community of Liverpool and Belfast and how it works and how it's come about and stuff. So there's a kind of recognition there too, of familiarity, which makes me feel very comfortable there, and I can't wait.